On the last episode, we were exploring the early days of hot rodding, early days of racing, especially centered around Barney Oldfield, who's kind of like the guy back in the day, kind of one of the early hot rodders in our opinions, because he was a little bit of an anti-establishment guy. He got banned from racing several times and kind of did his own thing, if you will. So definitely inspired a lot of the hot rodders to come in future generations. We were planning to meet with and shoot an episode with Bobby Green, who owns Old Crow Speed Shop. He also owns a bar called Oldfields. Huge fan of vintage racing, early pre-war. They weren't even called hot rods back then. They were called gouge jobs.
That's right.
More or less. And so that was what we were going to kind of dive into with him. Unfortunately, he does live in Altadena, and the fires, while they, didn't damage his property, it's obviously kind of chaos and hectic. So we're postponing that, and we are diving into the early years of land speed.
Yes.
Because we kind of had, hot rod in general, until maybe later on when it came more like show driven.
Yeah.
It was about going fast.
Obviously.
That's
right.
The entire purpose was, how fast can we go? And you either went, kind of the hot rod, kind of dirt track kind of route, or a lot of the guys that were still being employed while Barney was banned went kind of the land speed route. You have a lot of Sirs and British racers that kind of it was a little bit more. There's more money in it, so this was more of like F1 versus NASCAR, if you will, but it was about going fast. And also then you got to look at a lot of these places where they ran later on, the hot rod guys and the teenagers in the 40s and, even the late 30s, they'd go try to maybe not beat their record, but see what they could do on the same, stretch of road or dirt.
Right. Well, let's also kind of back up for a second here. We're talking early America.
Yeah.
From horse and buggy to automotive car.
Yeah, we're still in the early 1900s.
Right.
Even a little pre-World War I.
Right.
If you will.
You got a guy that comes out, gets in a set of frame rails and an engine and goes faster than a horse.
Yeah.
All of a sudden, he's the most famous guy in the world.
Well, and what's kind of interesting is you look at some of the early pictures of land speed cars.
They're racing horses, huh?
They were, but it was they had the aerodynamics kind of down.
Right.
But then they also just stuck it on a truck chassis, basically.
Right.
And it was 2 feet off the ground.
Yeah.
So the body that the guy sat in kind of had some shapes to it, like some points, but you're like, yeah, that thing's not aerodynamic at all.
And I'm sure that came from the coach builders that built buggies at the time.
It was basically like a buggy or a car, with a smaller body slapped on top of it.
Think of Fisher Body, who, obviously was the outfitter for General Motors for 80 years.
Yeah.
They were buggy manufacturers. That's why it was called Fisher Body.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So, but also too, think about this, that the cars back then, them being frame rails and engines, basically tractors on wheels, it wasn't like they turned well or handled well.
Yeah.
So there was the other thing about, there wasn't, also no tracks around, so you didn't have a lot of guys turning, so that's why land speed made a lot of sense.
Yeah.
Right?
Well, and you could get the fastest you could go would be, all right, how can I go in a straight line?
Right. Yeah.
And like you said, there was a lot of horse racing at the time, which some of it was quarter horse, maybe going straight line. Some of it was obviously
around
a track.
Right.
And then we did start to see the emergence of the more tracks that are a little more round, like Indy,
right?
Even in England and stuff like that, you had places like the Brooklands, which was a banked track, which
it was
they used that for bicycle racing a lot.
Exactly, and that was the first purpose-built track in Europe for car racing, automotive racing, because it was a bicycle velodrome at first, and then they expanded into what's known now.
Yeah.
But you're right. That was like, where would you do this? Even if you had the fastest car around, you still have no place to race it at, so you got to look for a place. So that also came with publicity, though. So if you were looking for a place, normally it would be like at a county fair or somewhere where there'd be a big collection of people, because most of these people, they wanted to make a name for themselves. Mm-hmm. And this was finally the name, like the farm boy could become famous if he goes,
this new fancy car, and I can go faster than any person around. And, we mentioned that a lot with Barney Oldfield, and of course, then with him going to a lot of those fairs and putting on exhibitions, he was banned from racing.
Exactly, right.
And there was another guy that came fairly shortly around the same time as Barney Oldfield, Eddie Rickenbacker, who also got banned by AAA for not what was it, promoting safety?
Right? Yes.
Yeah.
So that was the whole thing. Like back then, Indy was becoming the place to do this at, because obviously too, it had a large fairground and had a larger track. So people were trying to get into the Indy racing. Well, to do that, again, you had to be a name for yourself. You had to bring either money or talent. Well, a lot of these farm boys only had more talent than they had money. So that was the idea. Get to Indy, get into the race, and no matter what, you'll become a star. Well, Eddie did exactly that. And I think he got into like he tried 4 different times at Indy.
Yeah.
Before he actually made a name for himself.
Yeah. And that's it. He didn't win any of them.
Yeah.
You know, best finish that he had was like 10th out of
place.
it, which
still very respectful.
But that's the thing. Back then, these cars were obviously very rudimentary, and you know, we even look on later when we're talking about some of these guys that like qualified first and then crashed.
Yeah.
But then won the race afterwards. It's like, it was a tractor on wheels, more or less. So it was maybe easy to fix, but it's also easy to break.
Well, we're also thinking Indianapolis 500. You watch it Memorial Day weekend. It's on for about an hour and a half, 2 hours, and then it's done. Well, they're going 230 miles an hour, right? So let's go to Indy back then when Indy's still 500 miles. They have an oiler that's riding next to you. You have a relief driver that can.
So it's much more of an endurance race.
Exactly.
It's like 20. It'd be like equivalent of 24-hour of Le Mans,
right,
in a NASCAR, or something.
Yeah,
you know, versus what current Indy 500 is.
Right, exactly. You pulled over, your mechanic would help you with the car on the side. They wouldn't go to the pits. The pits came much later. You would just, I'm broken down. I pull over here. The guy's going to work on the car.
Yeah, you have the mechanic with you.
The guy's right there, right?
Yeah.
So it's just, you think back now, I think of, like you were saying, an endurance race. There's more strategy. There's more like, how am I really going to go the distance? Is my car going to last? You know, is my driver that good enough to take it into the next level? I mean, there's so many different things about car racing back then that have changed to now, but things just got faster.
No, and that's, so then, you're talking about the pit stops of, you know, I mean, even I remember looking at some videos or something of like IndyCar, I think it was, or maybe F1, but of a pit stop 20 years ago. Yeah. And they were like 8 seconds.
Yeah, right.
And I was like, oh, damn, they changed tires, have refueled, you know, whatever else they needed to do in 8 seconds. Yeah. And now they're like, what, 2 seconds?
Yeah,
or
exactly.
Even less than that?
Yeah, current F1 stuff is like where the guy comes in the car and vroom, 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 they're gone.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's just insane. So that's, everything had to get faster in order to compete. And that's, like we said, that's what land speed, that's what hot rodding, that's what all this was about, was as fast as you could go. And, you know, we mentioned Bonneville being the first to go 60 miles an hour.
Right.
He also then, you know, in the Blitz and Bend set a record in Daytona going 131 miles an hour.
Right.
And that was in 1910. So not super long after he'd already gone, you know, a couple of years after going only 60 miles an hour.
Well, you see the technology ramp just skyrocket.
Yeah.
Because it became so volatile. Like this racing thing became such a big deal that everybody started throwing their name and their hat into this deal. So they wanted things to go fast, obviously. Yeah. So you're going to have the technology, like, you know, Barney goes 130 one month, and then Bob Berman in the same car a month later goes at 10 miles an hour faster. Yeah. Now that too, a lot of people go, oh, it's only 10 miles an hour. When you're chasing a record, that's like saying it's going 100 miles an hour faster. Yeah.
Well, and that's and we're talking. And then he did it in the same car.
In the same car. In the same place, too. So,
in Daytona
So the technology got better. You know, they figured more things out. They dialed the car in better.
Yeah. And you also got to look, like we were mentioning, of a couple years going from 60 miles an hour to 130 miles an hour. Yeah. And then, that's a 70 mile an hour jump. Right. You know, so let's say 10 miles an hour every year or something like that. And then 1 month, it's another 10 miles an hour. Right. And then it ramped up kind of almost exponentially there, right? Up until World War II, when then things kind of changed again. But we're getting ahead of ourselves,
right? Well, yeah, let's go back to Eddie too, because Eddie was not just a car racer. And when we say, you know, how Barney and guys like Eddie, these guys were the current.
They were adrenaline junkies. They were speed demons. They were.
But they're like our regular day celebrities, like how we treat them now. Like we look at those guys were on every newspaper, every edition for every 5 editions a day. Those guys were in the newspaper every edition every day. Eddie Rickenbacker went on to be a World War I ace pilot, though, and he's called the ace of aces in the U.S. Air Force, because back then there was no Air Force. There was just biplanes. Yeah. And Eddie was the first guy to become an American ace. So he was decorated hugely when he came home. And throughout the rest of his life was a big name. And he actually was the CEO of Eastern Airlines for like, I don't know, 20 or 30 years.
Yeah. So he seems like he kind of went more towards
the aviation
route
yes.
than the car route,
Yeah.
you know, but a lot of these guys, you know, we'll bring up, especially with the next guy with, you know, Sir Henry Seagrave.
Yes.
It might be Seagrave or Seagrave.
Well, it depends if
there's no
where
A.
you're from. Which part of the pond are you on? Because we'll say
Yeah.
Seagrave, right?
Yeah. But he went, you know, he ended up doing a lot of boat racing, you know, on the water. And then a lot of these guys would do, aviation, cars.
Well,
it was just,
they would race anything. They would race a plane. They would race, you know, and that how they would swoop down and the guy in the car would come up. That would be a big attraction.
Yeah.
They would race horses. They would race boats. You know, they would race pretty much anything that would go fast because that would get the newspaper's attention.
Yeah.
Because the other thing too is, let's think of the other side of that. You're only a daredevil for so long.
and that's the unfortunate part, because I think for the most part, except for one or two, the rest of these guys we're talking about had pretty short careers, but pretty insane careers as well with their racing. And that's, you mentioned about the popularity, the being in the newspapers. Obviously, that then helps them with the sponsorships. I mean, this is kind of also, I think, a little bit of the time. I mean, advertising wasn't a huge thing until the late 1800s.
Right.
And now we're getting into the, era where advertising and posters and brand names are becoming a thing, because this is after the Industrial Revolution.
Right.
So a lot of companies started to attach themselves, to this. And a lot of it, a lot of tire companies.
Yes. That came from Henry and Barney, though.
Yeah.
Because Henry or Barney volunteering to drive Henry's car, and what the result of that was for Ford, people took note of that. And Harvey Firestone, obviously was Henry Ford's good friend, so that was the first relationship that he had with Barney Oldfield. Well, that stuck, and everybody saw how.
And that's Dunlop was involved in a lot of land speed sponsorships, and then of course you had your general stuff like, Barney had his cigar. I don't know if he had a sponsor for that, but then a lot of cigarette companies would sponsor these racers and all that kind of stuff. Motor oil companies, obviously all that kind of stuff.
But even the cigarette, that was still the cool guy. I mean, even this is prior to James Dean, that was your cool guy thing, like light up a cigarette. That was they were selling that persona of the tough guy driving that fast car.
Yeah. And that's the thing. So, and we talked about, now as things start to ramp up, you're getting over 130, 140, 150 miles an hour.
Right.
Now they kind of start expanding to where they can do it at, because you start going even faster. You need a lot more open land.
Oh yeah.
And we mentioned Daytona Beach.
Beach.
Yeah.
Let's.
So it's not the speedway yet. This is actually on the beach.
Yes.
But then they did the same thing. You got beaches in England.
Right.
In Wales and stuff like that. So you had places like Pennant Sands, and then people were starting to mess a little bit with the dry lake beds out here, and then Bonneville, but that came a little bit later.
Yeah.
A lot of this stuff was out on the beach, and I think just because that's where there was open land and you could get a lot of people out there.
Yeah. I mean, think about it too. If you're a racer trying to put every dollar into your car to go fast, you don't have any money to promote. So if there's not a track around, you're going to go to wherever you can do it at.
Yeah.
We would now look at it as a deserted road out in the middle of the desert, right? Where we'd try to, do something on our own. Well, those guys were doing the same thing. There wasn't a deserted road on the desert. There was a beach.
Well, there wasn't anything long enough to be able to start going this fast.
Right.
And the horsepower had a lot to do with that.
Oh yeah. Let's go back to Seagrave real quick.
Well, that's what I'm saying. Yeah, Seagrave, his, he started in 1926, he set a 152 mile an hour record.
Yeah.
And that was in a 1,000 horsepower dual engine,
Sunbeam, right?
Yeah.
Which it was called the Sunbeam Tiger.
Yeah.
Which
that's a lot of these land speed cars were Sunbeams.
Yes.
That was the manufacturer doing a lot of these.
And let's clarify that too, because Sunbeam, I don't know if you remember the TV show Get Smart, the TV show, not the movie.
Yeah.
Okay. He drives up in a little Sunbeam Tiger.
Okay.
Which was a really popular.
And that was the one that transformed into his shoe that he.
Well, of course, yeah. But I mean, it's funny. Like you think of a Sunbeam Tiger, you think of this little small car that they did have
And that's a
289s in
small
them.
British car. or
Right,
something,
right.
yeah.
I mean, they were really fun little cars, but you just don't think of like them as a big car company.
Yeah.
Right? You think of this small little sports car company. Well, guess what? Back in the 20s, they're with 2 500 horsepower each engines. They're going to, 150 miles an hour with 1,000 horsepower.
Yeah. No, and that's what's crazy. And so he was actually the first to crack 200 miles an hour.
Okay.
And did that in Daytona as well on the beach. And actually called that the mystery car or the slug car.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
So, and that's what's interesting too. He even then kept upping his own record because, fairly soon he started going 230 miles an hour.
Right.
And
let's clarify that too. When you say mile an hour,
yeah,
because back then,
and even
it wasn't like a flying mile. This was, you had to go one way, one direction, and then you have to come back. So they call it a back and forth.
Yeah. And that's very similar throughout and for all land speed records, because obviously it's been even through, timing associations that have kind of regulated these rules over the years and kind of solidified the records. You have to back it up.
Right.
You can't just go all out in one shot and hope for the best and maybe you blow up at the end. No, you got to repeat it.
Right, yeah. I mean, that's the whole thing. It's not bragging if you can't back it up. Mm-hmm. So if you go fast one way, that could be a total fluke. The thing ran good, and like you said, it could have leaned out and burned a piston, but you still got the record.
Yeah.
You got to
do it again.
You got to do it again.
Yeah. And so now I think at Bonneville and stuff like that, they'll do, or even some of the deserts out in like Oregon or Nevada, they'll do it at the same.
It's the same direction
just because they know
Safety.
everything's safe and logistics of where everybody is. But they had to do there and back.
And that's funny because you mentioned like, the there and back thing. So in boat racing, there was a time that we were actually chasing a kilo record. Because in boat racing, they measure it by kilos. They don't measure it by mile or, flying. They say for some reason, kilo is the one.
Well, and even just real quick on a lot of the early records, especially when the British guys, and even it was, the records were being listed as first over 200 kilometers an hour,
right?
Which was like 160 or something miles an hour, let's say,
right?
But like they were measuring, and then it finally kind of got standardized a little bit.
Yeah, a little bit, yeah. But in boat racing, you go there and back because of currents, because you might be racing on a river, and if the river has a current of 5 miles an hour, well, you're going to be 5 miles an hour faster going one direction. So obviously, you got to come back the other direction.
Yeah, there's going to be the difference of the current, the sun. There's. Yeah, you can't just ride the current the whole way and then, the next guy does it the other way and the current's going different. And,
and then like, wait a second, that guy has an advantage. So that's why, they still do that. But car racing, it being with just safety in mind, one direction, we can see what's going on. We know what's down track.
And then back it up again.
Right.
And then a lot of times, so you'd see, let's say if it's, the record they're going for is 201 miles an hour, they'll knock a 207 or even higher. And then they won't beat the record because the next one came in at 198.
Yep.
Or
they don't average up.
Broke down or couldn't make the second pass.
It's happened to me. I mean, we went, our record in our class was 121.9 miles an hour. It's been that record since the 90s. And we went 123.6.
Yeah. So you beat the record.
So we beat the record, but we didn't back it up.
Yeah. But the second lap, what happened on the second?
Oh, we went 119.
No, and that's the thing. So like you're right at that thing, but not enough to
you still gotta back it up.
Beat the other guy. And that kind of leads me to something else before we get back into some of these racers. So the first land speed records in the early or late 1800s, early 1900s were all electric.
Right.
They were all electric cars.
Yeah.
And then even some steam cars.
Right. That's the technology of the time.
And that's what the technology of at the time. And then, of course, like, internal combustion then started to ramp up. And that was just in general with cars. That was kind of like, okay, this is the way to go.
Yeah.
But like they had steam powered records.
Right.
A couple of them. And then no one broke that record from 1906 to 2009. So over 100 years.
Because nobody cared.
That's what my guess is. It wasn't that like no one could beat it.
Right.
It was just why.
Yeah.
So if you're still rocking your stock stereo system, you need some help. And you need to go to Powerbase and check out their OEM direct fit line of speakers. Basically a plug-and-play operation on any newer Chevy, Ford, Dodge, Nissan, you name it. And I actually got a full set in my Toyota 4Runner. It sounds amazing, especially considering you're basically just replacing the factory speakers. So go check them out at powerbaseusa.com. Use the code AUTOREV24 and you can get 10% off anything on the site, including these cool little Bluetooth speakers. This one right here is the Sound Cube. Clip it onto your backpack, take it down to the beach. And what's really cool is this split speaker. So you can put one in the kitchen, one in the backyard at a party. Everyone's having a good time listening to the same music. Basically got like full stereo, almost surround sound system in this little package. So if you use the code AUTOREV24, you can get 10% off. So go check them out and take a listen.
If you think about it, Steam's technology just ran out of gas. For the matter,
ran out of steam.
Right? Ran out of steam. But no, seriously, if you look at it, the amount of parts that those guys were scattering from the pressure that they were using with steam, it didn't make sense.
You couldn't go
that
fast.
No, and it's just too much money at the time. Like to make that technology happen, you'd have to pour double the amount of money. When all of a sudden there's this ICE engine sitting right here that you can put that in, you're done.
So then, more or less since early 1900s, from then on, that kind of took over until much later. Which we'll get into that with, jet engines, turbines, rockets,
the thrust cars.
The thrust cars,
yes.
So this is still, propulsion,
Yes.
Internal combustion.
Yes.
And that's, one of the cool ones that Seagrave did. One of the cool cars he had was the Golden Arrow.
Yeah.
That was kind of one of the iconic ones.
Right. Because he held the record. No, I'm sorry.
Yeah, so he upped the record in 29. So he did, so his records were 152, 200, and there's some in between, but these are kind of the milestones.
Right.
But then, one of his last runs, if you will, was 231.
Okay.
In the Golden Arrow.
Golden Arrow, right.
And then he decided to not do land speed racing anymore after a fellow racer named Lee Bible died in a crash.
Yes.
And then unfortunately, about a year later, he was attempting a boat record on water and died in that crash.
Yeah.
So, but I mean, that's the thing. Like you said, these guys
daredevils don't live long.
Yeah. He also did aviation. He designed aircraft and did all that. So, and what's interesting with the guy Lee Bible is originally that was supposed to be a race driven by a guy named Ray Keech.
Okay.
Who had
Sorry, keep going.
No, and so he was an IndyCar champ.
Right.
He set the Daytona record in 29. Before Henry Seagrave then kind of beat him. So that all these guys were kind of going back and forth. And I think there was a couple of issues with the car. He decided not to run the one that then Lee Bible flipped it and then crashed in.
Right.
And so that's what then caused Henry Seagrave to not
step back,
take a step back. But then of course, Ray Keech passed away in a 200-mile-an-hour race in Altoona, Pennsylvania, at the fairgrounds there.
Yeah.
A lot of these guys, they were daredevils and they were going all out. And this was before. I mean, this was around the time that then we talked about Barney Oldfield and Miller and stuff started introducing a roll cage into these because this was happening to these guys. These are all just open cars. It flips.
Exactly. You're done. Barney's very famous car of Barney's, one of his track cars had on the side of that he would barnstorm in would say, "My only life insurance, Firestone tires." Mm-hmm. So tire technology also was another big deal that made this happen because again, too, you're going, let's say, the tires are made to go 40 miles an hour. Now you're going 150 miles an hour. You're going to have tire failures, which obviously we can talk more about some of the drivers
that's what happened
right.
With a lot of them. And that was kind of leading us into I think one of the cool land speed cars of this era.
I know you're going to say
with Frank Lockhart and the Stutz Blackhawk.
Yep.
That streamliner.
It's
super
so cool. Right.
This was when they started way more getting into the aerodynamics of it. Started closing the wheels off to reduce some of the drag.
It reminds me of because back then airplane racing was a big deal. Aviation racing, where you'd actually have like these big I don't know what they call them, pylons or something like that. They'd fly around.
Yeah, so it's kind of like a little course or something.
Right,
like
and there was a plane called a GB, and it was this short but tall plane made for flat out speed. And the Golden Hawk has that kind of look to it. It has like you said, how the tires are kind of all covered.
Yeah.
And everything looks very streamlined, very aerodynamic. Well, it totally reminds me of those planes.
Yeah.
And I'm sure that's where they got the idea from. I'm sure they kind of looked at like, well, what's that doing? Why can't we do this?
Yeah, it's, all the technology was starting to advance where they, you had guys like your Millers and stuff like that, and your Henry Ford that were doing stuff on the engines. You had the tire companies that were ramping up the technology of the rubber.
Right.
And then, of course, guys starting to kind of figure out aerodynamics.
Yeah.
And figure out, like, okay, a giant, this is going to go
barn door is not going to work.
Yeah. A barn door is going to go a lot slower than an arrow.
Right,
you
right.
know, and that's probably where a lot of it came from, too, was from technology from,
prior,
weapons and arrows and
trains, like a locomotive.
As well.
You look at how they did that kind of stuff. Frank Lockhart to me is, he's LA boy. That's why I kind of like him.
Yeah, especially in the time of a lot of these guys were British and more upscale.
Well, even the American guys. You look at Barney and Eddie were Midwest boys.
Yeah, they're your farm boys.
Right, your farm boys, right. But Frank was, your LA boy, grew up in Culver City, was a IndyCar kind of standout.
Yeah.
Got involved with it.
And that's the thing. And so he was a young guy. He was younger than some of these other guys. So he was in his late teens when he started getting into racing.
Yeah.
And he was actually in 1926 at the Indy 500, he won it in a supercharged Miller.
Right.
And he was actually the relief driver for the normal guy.
There you go, relief driver.
But he qualified first.
Yeah.
And set a track record.
Okay.
For first qualifying lap. And so they basically were like, all right, then you're the dude.
And you're the dude, right? Yeah, yeah.
And like we mentioned before, he crashed on the second qualifier, but they were able to get it back and running and, started out, won that race.
There you go.
He ended up winning several races that year. Was one of the first rookies to win, like I said, to win Indian.
Right? Yeah.
And he won 4 AAA championships, got second overall in points, for AAA that, in his rookie year.
Right.
And that was 1926. So he was
a driver.
He was a star on the rise.
Right.
And it's pretty cool actually too. Like he was the first to race and win in a car that had an intercooler.
Okay.
Because obviously they were supercharging these.
Right.
They got that from the plane.
Yeah.
Aviation world.
Yeah.
But intercooling, cooling down the air that was being supercharged added a whole other.
There's that technology
level.
ramp.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
And so he ended up doing, Daytona, which we'll get to that later.
Sure.
But he set a land speed record out at the Muroc dry lake beds. Like I said, he was a West Coast kid.
Yeah.
Obviously that's out in LA, Edwards Air Force Base.
It's now Edwards
basically.
Air Force Base, right?
Yeah. And there's a lot of, the dry lake beds out, different dry lake beds out around Southern California. El Mirage became more popular, I'd say, with like the hot rod guys.
The hot rod guys got an El Mirage, yeah.
But yeah, he set a record out there for 160. And then he was also set the opening lap record at Indy.
Okay.
And that record lasted for 64 years.
Oh, wow.
So up until the 80s, basically.
That would be, right.
Set the opening lap record.
That's to go back in time and to look at something like that, to be there at that time, to then look at something that's going to last 64 years before someone, recreates that. That's pretty insane.
Yeah, and think of the race technology of Indy cars.
Right, yeah. You got to go through all of that
time,
right?
And until now.
Yep.
But yeah, so a lot of companies saw him coming up. A lot of companies like Stutz started offering him cars.
Yeah.
He bought the first car, then they gave him a car. He had some deals with the tire companies.
Yeah.
Like we were saying. And that Stutz Blackhawk Special that we mentioned. It's super cool car.
It's still the coolest car.
But they ran that out in Daytona on the beach, and he on his first run clocked 203 miles an hour.
Right.
So was kind of on par with the record at the time.
Right.
I think
he was a contender.
It was in that 200 mile an hour range. So it was going. And then unfortunately, and there's still a little bit of debate
happened.
of exactly what happened or how it happened.
Right.
Some saying like that one of his rear tires had gotten a blister on it in the first run,
Right.
and then it burst on the second run, spun him, threw him into the ocean,
Right.
and
Killed him.
he died.
Right.
There's been some people have said that like a seashell or something may have
Cut the tire down.
cut the tire.
Yeah.
And that might be too why they maybe kind of stopped doing a lot of things on
The beach.
in Daytona, because there
Yeah.
are maybe some more when you're going
Natural-
that fast,
right,
you're going
right.
200 miles an hour.
Yeah.
The slightest thing can happen.
Well, I mean, let's look at NHRA drag racing right now.
Yeah.
So they're knocking on 350 mile an hour's door in a quarter, in 1,000 feet. Not even
Yeah.
a quarter mile anymore.
Yeah.
Right. Goodyear has told, which Goodyear is the only tire manufacturer that makes a tire rated for this type of racing. And they flat out told NHRA, slow the cars down.
Yeah.
They can't have the technology of the tires.
There's something that's
there's
the
not
weak
going to
link.
work. Right.
Yeah.
And so you look at that track, and like if you ever go there and you see how they're like basically blowing and vacuuming the track before you do a 350 mile an hour run.
Yeah.
There's a reason for that.
Yeah. Because the slightest
Just
rock or anything
right.
can do it. And you know, so that's what we say. We started seeing more people going out to the lake beds where there was nothing.
Well,
more or less.
Well, and also
or
you
could see.
You could see it. You could look the track. It wasn't, the conditions weren't going to change.
Yeah.
Right. Because the
the tide wasn't going to come
right,
in and
right.
out, and then
Yeah.
one day to the next it might be a little different. Something gets
Right.
blown in from the water.
Yeah. Because
And
believe me, I've gone to El Mirage as a kid to ride motorcycles, and it is mirror flat.
yeah,
Now it's this kind of sooty, kind of like powdery,
very powdery.
very powdery.
Yeah.
Because obviously, think about it; it's the bottom of a lake.
Yeah.
So it is, this very fine sand.
yeah,
But
kind
there's
of dried, cracked mud,
right,
if you will.
But there's
Yeah.
no pebbles. There's no
Yeah.
small rocks. There's no sharp nothing.
Yeah.
So that was an ideal place.
And that also means then your passes are going to be more reliable,
Right.
Where you're removing
Your
that
consistency,
variable
right, yeah.
from the equation.
Yeah.
Where then you can just focus on the car and
Right.
your driving and stuff
Well,
like
think
that.
about even being on the beach and like maybe a riptide changed the bottom of the ground a little bit. And now you're going 200 and you've got to go through a speed bump.
Yeah.
Yeah, right.
Basically. Yeah.
Right. So-
And that's, kind of leads us into our guys that are kind of like your very well-known, like guys that actually had longer careers where they could set more records.
True. Well,
Thankfully.
I guess you're going to bring up Sir Malcolm Campbell.
Sir Malcolm Campbell.
Yes.
Yeah.
Because he actually didn't die. He died of natural causes.
Yes. Yeah. And that's the thing. He was able to set 9 land speed records.
Yeah.
Most of them were beating his own record.
Right.
Because he had a long career.
Yeah.
That lasted for quite some time.
Yeah.
But yeah, the first record that he set was in 1924.
Right.
And it was 146.
Yeah.
So that's the same. Like, all these guys were battling over 10 miles an hour for quite a while, and then he started reaching and ramping up into 100 miles an hour, 200 miles an hour, stuff like that.
Right.
But you mentioned Brooklyn, the track in England.
Yeah, Brooksland.
Yeah. So he said he was the first to go 100 miles an hour
Yeah.
at that track.
Right.
So
And again, let's think about 100 miles an hour in something that mimics a small go-kart.
yeah, I mean, this was the mid-20s, so
Right.
they're starting to get a little bit nicer and better, but they were still very
They're not your
rudimentary.
full race car enclosed. Yes.
But that's where then his kind of claim to fame was the Bluebird car,
Right.
or multiple cars,
Multiples, yeah.
and they were all that. They
Yes.
were all very this is land speed.
Yeah.
This is longer,
Yeah.
lower, sleeker,
Right.
streamliners.
Yeah.
And this is what a lot of the later hot rod guys would emulate for land speed.
Right.
Like we talk about Alex Exidius, we'll talk about him and SoCal Speed Shop. Well, the SoCal Speed Shop Streamliner
Looks, yeah.
is very similar to,
Right.
because that was then, okay, this is the best way to go for that type of racing.
Exactly. In that style of car, even, and you people out there in this line are going to kill me.
Put in the comments below if we get it wrong.
The Mormon missile.
Okay.
We'll talk about that. It's
Are we talking about that now
no,
or later?
we're going to talk about it later because it
Okay.
is something later. It's something. It's late 50s, but it's that same style of Bluebird car
Yeah.
that they used. So
Was it Mormon Missile because they were racing it in Utah and on the Bonneville Salt Flats, and they were all Mormons?
And they're all Mormons. So yeah.
Interesting. I didn't know Mormons were allowed to race. Sorry.
See, leave the comments. Too.
Yeah. Sorry. No, but
they wear magic underwear. So
cut that. So Sir Malcolm Campbell, and he was an Army officer as well,
Yes.
and that's why he more or less kind of retired after World War II.
Right.
Kind of happened, because of all that. But one of the final records that he set was actually set in Bonneville. Is when they started
Right.
going in Bonneville
In the 30s.
In the 30s, 1935,
Okay.
and that was, like we said, you start going. He was going 300 miles an hour.
Right.
So let's say he set a record going 146.
Yeah.
10 years later, he sets a record going 300.
Yeah. What
Double.
happened? Yeah. What happened?
Double.
Right.
And that's, you look at the car, the design of the car,
Yep.
the horsepower, all this started to come together.
Yep.
At that time. And yeah, Bonneville, they were running out of room. Like I said, the beach, they were running out of room.
Yeah.
Even maybe in some places in the desert, they're running out of room.
Yeah.
And so Bonneville really became the haven or the heaven for hot rodders
Right.
and land speed for decades upon decades, even till now.
Well, it was the guys that were going to get serious.
Yeah.
Because there was even talks about in the 30s when the gal jobs guys would just drive their cars out to El Mirage or to Muroc just to make like street racing passes.
Yeah.
So that was kind of
Yeah,
known
they
as
couldn't
like
go
Yeah.
80 miles an hour, let's say, on LA streets, so
Right.
they'd go out to the desert.
right, which
Yeah.
was wasn't that big of a deal. But if you're trying to go 300, Muroc or even El Mirage was not the place to do it. It just wasn't big enough.
Yeah.
So Bonneville was this huge place that nobody really ever had a purpose for. So of course, it's this virgin land that was useless, but it was flat, straight, and
Same
long.
thing. Yeah.
Right.
All salt, so you could see, you can
Anything.
see any imperfections. You
Right.
can see where there's any, anything on the track, and
Right.
yeah, just tons of open room. And unfortunately, what's happened in the last few years on and off is it gets flooded out.
All right.
But one thing interesting too, like they're saying, like if you even just drive a regular car out on the salt flats,
Yeah.
that salt's never going away.
Right.
It's going to be
Yeah. You're done.
part of that car
Right.
forever.
Right. Exactly. Right. And that's why land speed racing is very expensive for that.
Yeah.
Think about it. You take it out and you drive it one pass. You take the entire car apart.
Yeah.
Not just like, oh, take the motor out of it and maybe steam. No. You take the entire thing apart. So yeah, it's huge to run a program these days, which we'll get into that more as well. So
No,
back to Malcolm Campbell. I was going to say probably England's version of Barney or Eddie Rickenbacker.
Yeah. Because
he was
synonymous with the name.
Exactly.
He was in a lot of magazine and newspaper ads
Right.
for everything from cigarettes to watches to
Right.
all that kind of stuff.
and gave the American guys a big kind of
and that's
come check this out. This is
what we're
doing.
talking about
Right.
too, of like if guys were in the late 20s hitting over 200, and that was like the general range of the record.
Right.
He came in and was for a while like the only person to beat records because he was beating his own record.
Right.
And then 1935 he hits 300.
Yeah. And the good thing about it too is that technology rubbed off on a lot of other people because Malcolm Campbell, he was making his own tires. He was making his own equipment. He was building his own cars. He wasn't going after a car manufacturer. Hey, I want to do this. Let's modify your car. He was like, nope, ground up. This is what I'm doing.
Yeah. Purpose built for
right.
land speed for,
And so that's what I think was the difference with just his technology, his equipment, the way that he just had the information. So yeah, that's why he's going to keep beating records. He's
And
like,
I would also say that he just didn't crash and get killed
He's
in
gotta
it. So
have
he was able to keep going.
I mean, I guess he had a wheelbarrow to walk around with because he had to have a set of balls, right?
Yeah, exactly.
But,
how could he fit that in the small Bluebird?
Right. And the other thing, too, is he was also very famous in boat racing. However, his son was the one that was the most successful in the boat. So his son was the guy that I want to say
Don Campbell.
Don Campbell, yes. And I think he's the first guy to go 300 on water.
Oh wow, on water.
Which is still like
that's still pretty insane.
Yeah, that's very insane to do that. Which I think is so funny too. You're a car racer that you want to do something safer, so you get into a boat.
Well, and that's what happened with
Seagrave,
right. And some other guys too. It's
insane. But that technology I think rubbed off on a lot of the English guys too, because John Cobb comes behind Sir Malcolm Campbell, who's another English guy. Very well-known racer at that time too, but he comes back with the Railton Special?
Yeah, the Railton Special.
Which again, like you said, it looks a lot like the Streamliner that was built for Alex Exidius.
Yeah.
Right?
No, and that's, this guy, this era is kind of what kind of bridges the gap, and leads us into World War II.
Right.
Because there were your younger crowd, your teenagers, taking their cars or their grandmas and their mom's cars, same as has been done throughout history.
Right.
Even before the war, stripping them down, making them
light as possible,
to try to go as fast as possible. Yeah. And those were called gow jobs.
Yep.
And there's some other names for them and stuff, and like souping up and and hot rodding kind of came as like the overall umbrella name after World War II. But like gow jobs even kind of crept into that part later, but we'll definitely get into that when we talk to Bobby. Hopefully nothing else happens. But John Cobb was, coming on the kind of the heels of Malcolm Campbell in the late 30s. That's what's crazy what we're talking about of the ramp up in the power. So 1935, 300 miles an hour is the record.
Right.
John Cobb has, does three records.
He beats
at
it. Right.
350.
Yeah.
And then,
the war
400 was his last one in 1939.
Right.
And then the war happened.
But he didn't back up the because he doesn't back up the 400 miles an hour doesn't happen until after the war.
Okay.
And
so
he's
he
the
didn't
first
back
guy
it up. That's right. Yeah.
He's the first guy to go 400 miles an hour, but it's not until like 47.
Yeah.
But
and that's
he was knocking on the door at 39.
There was no
right.
land speed records set from 1939 until 1947.
I wonder why.
Because a lot of these guys became pilots.
Yes. And John Cobb being a very decorated one as well.
Yeah. So he was a decorated fighter pilot in World War II for the British
the Royal Air Force.
Royal Air Force.
Yes.
There you go. And that's the thing. So obviously, a lot of people were getting drafted into service, into the war.
Right.
A lot of these areas were not, the manufacturing was all becoming stuff for war efforts and all that.
Right.
But that is also, you kind of take the Daredevil and the land speed, that now opened up to thousands upon thousands of soldiers and young soldiers who are learning how to work on aircraft, learning how to work on Jeeps, learning how to work on tanks and rigs, and had that bug and some of the knowledge to come back from the war and start trying to do it themselves. And they were emulating a lot of these land speed guys that still were doing the land speed thing, but now you had guys who were younger, DIY, out of your garage, out of your back of your farmhouse in the barn, that were now capable, and the technology was there also as well to be able to kind of do it themselves, and that's what gave birth to hot rodding.
Right, no, 100%. I mean, the greatest thing, I guess the silver lining of the war is this. You took a farm boy into the Industrial Revolution, and he came out with the knowledge of, I could fix things, I could make things go faster, I can fix things on the fly. I liked going fast, I liked... Right. Yeah. I mean, I can fix things in the mud because, I have the technology, and that just all of a sudden exploded. I mean, think of this too, like nitrous was in planes. All of a sudden some farm boy that's driving a tractor, you mean you could put this bottle of something in here and it goes faster? Yeah. Superchargers, turbochargers, all of that stuff. Or just learning about just even
like we talk about, like AN fittings.
Right. Army Navy.
So that was fittings. All like all the fittings and all the little parts and machining, you know, like a lot of these guys like Ed Iskandarian, I believe, learned machining in the Navy in the war. Yeah. And so they could take this and apply it. Well, now they're back. Yeah. They got to do something.
I got to do something.
Yeah. I could either keep farming or no, I can work on these machines. I can work on these cars, these planes. Right. And a lot of it too, we talk about kind of the Midwest and like England with the land speed stuff. Right. When you look at the foundation of hot rodding, it's West Coast, it's LA. Yeah. And that's because a lot of the aerospace and industrial stuff was here. Yeah. Right. Because it wasn't here, you're able to then load it on a, aircraft carrier. Yep. You're able to fly it out. There's obviously some distance in between, but then, logistics wise, it made sense to be on the West Coast.
Well, LA is the reason why LA is such an important part of hot rodding is space. Yeah. For number one,
not space.
not that. Well, it ended up being space too.
Yes,
but
space.
but space area.
Yeah.
Right, because you had area to. There was nowhere else you were going to build planes in the country at that time.
Yeah.
Because, like you said, you couldn't get goods and services to Nebraska. You could get goods and services to L.A., and you had an area that was large enough to build bombers, fighters, so on and so forth. And like you said, you could fly them out. The other thing, too, was you had open streets, not backcountry roads. So now you have these hot rod kids that can go out with their whatever and try, the new Stromberg that they just took off of this plane, and they're going to put on this, car and go out down Van Nuys Boulevard because it's straight, concrete, and has curbs. It's not this.
Yeah.
Right? So LA was the perfect place for this to happen. Now, England was also very similar. You had the people the want and the need, but you had very few areas. So that's why.
And also, too, they were much more hit by the war.
Exactly.
So there was a lot of
there's more
recovery and
rebuilding,
which didn't have that here.
But that's what you also look at there. The reason why F1 and road racing became so popular in England after the war was because, again, country roads, and they had small sports cars.
So smaller circular tracks versus full land speed. And that's what, so you kind of had a divergence as well. And we'll kind of go down each of these paths after, obviously with hot rodding, with the pre-war, the post-war kind of birth of the industry. But then you really started to see where people either went land speed or drag racing. So it was like, okay, if you were sticking to the streets or the concrete, drag racing, NHRA, Robert Peterson, Wally Parks.
Yeah.
But then you had a lot of guys that still stuck with kind of the land speed type stuff, and they mix and match.
Yeah.
But then you had the land speed stuff where it wasn't about going as fast as you could in a short distance. It was how fast can you go in general.
Right.
And I think we were talking earlier about, what's the current like record for a piston driven land speed car.
Oh yeah, we're talking Speed Demon right now.
Yeah,
so
it's
George
Speed
Petit's,
Demon, George Petit's, who's passed away, but Chris Raschke, ARP, and their family has been continuing it on. That was a Rad Rides by Troy build. Kenny Duttweiler did the engine on it.
Right. Engines.
Yes.
Yes. So you're looking at that right now. So you mentioned Chris Raschke. Chris Raschke, who's not the he's just a backup crew driver.
Yeah.
I'm part of the crew, but he's a backup driver, and we know him personally. He just went 458 in that car.
Yeah.
And he doesn't even drive it all the time.
But that's what's great. So we're talking about John Cobb in the late 40s after the war, hits 400 miles an hour.
Right. Insane.
So we talk about the ramping up of 200 plus miles an hour additional in 10 years. Well, now we're 70 years later, and it's only gone up 500 it's only gone up 50 miles an hour.
Yeah.
But that's only on the internal combustion piston-driven cars.
Right.
Because that's said, there's a little bit of a limit when you get to that point. And then the guys that were going real fast started looking at the jet engines.
Right.
The turbo jets, all that.
The war changes everything.
Yeah.
Because the war exposes people to rockets, to different types of propulsion. You're not now just relying on
way more aerodynamics.
Yeah. Right. So that's something we'll get into the next episode.
Yeah, and so we're gonna hopefully reconnect with Bobby.
Yes.
Talk about the very early stages of the hot rod guys. trying to emulate the land speed racers, kind of do their own thing, leading into then the war and post World War II, and then we'll take it from there and keep going with the history of hot rodding and going fast.